Imagine that you're a hospital administrator in spring 2022. One of your jobs is acquiring a supply of N95 masks to protect your hospital's staff. That's an important job, and you can probably imagine that there are rules about who you can buy those masks from, what kind of documentation you have to do, etc. Now imagine that it's 2018. You're not a hospital administrator, you're a hobbyist carpenter. One of the things on your to-do list today is buy an N95 mask. Now, your process for acquiring an N95 mask is going to look pretty different from when you were imagining yourself as a hospital administrator. Why is that? Well, to state the obvious, what's different are the potential impacts. Who is affected by your decisions and how deeply? You're doing the same activity, purchasing N95 masks, but the change in context changes what is proper for your behavior, and in a way that cannot be anticipated or solved for by the mask's manufacturer. Whereas technical functions like the mask's filtration can be achieved within the controls and limitations of a lab, social outcomes, like the safety of a group of people, are messy. They're the result of interplay between continuously changing groups of actors, institutions, rules, and materials. Because of this, social or normative intentions are typically negotiated, designed for, and steered towards in particular contexts. Within a particular context, a system's ability to work toward a specific social impact requires that it develop certain capabilities, including awareness of both system inputs like masks and outputs like disease positivity rates. These capabilities are commonly referred to as due diligence and impact assessment, respectively. For a system with social intentions like fairness, accountability, or transparency to achieve those impacts in a particular context, it's not enough for it only to have an awareness of those it interacts with. The system must also be responsive to their agency and participation. In other words, systems need mechanisms for stakeholders to communicate when the system is failing them, as well as mechanisms for redressing those unintended harms and for making sure they don't happen again. How a system does these things, due diligence, impact assessment, participation, and adaptation, is totally dependent on its context, particularly the scale and nature of its impact on the world. To repeat, that's a dependent relationship, where the design and operation of governance relies on the system's situatedness in a context. Attempts to invert that relationship to resolve governance questions outside of those contexts, upstream, in the lab, reveal a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of governing systems for social outcomes. This is precisely what the mainstream of FACT research attempts, which is why we argue that FACT's goals can't, as currently framed, be achieved by the FACT community, and why much of the work to make AI and ML socially beneficial is, in fact, counterfactual. To illustrate FACT's acontextual approach, and more importantly, the reasons why it's not only ineffective at achieving its goals, but actively undermines them, we're going to focus on a particular group of FACT community projects and proposals that rely on a related set of strategies. We chose this group of projects as representative of FACT approaches broadly because they're widely cited, they've inspired a myriad of similar projects, including at this year's FACT conference, and they've been subject to relatively little critical scrutiny. These proposals argue that technologists should dramatically increase their efforts towards documenting their work, where and how they get their data, how their models are constructed, how their services operate, with particular attention paid to how different demographic groups are represented and recognized by these technical objects. These projects include well-known proposals like data sheets for datasets, model cards for model reporting, fact sheets, and dataset nutrition labels. We call this group of projects metadata maximalism. The metadata maximalists, broadly speaking, claim that their work will accomplish their social goals through some combination of three ways. One, that through the labor of producing this documentation, technologists will become sensitized to the ethical dimensions of their work and self-correct towards more ethical practice. Two, that the companies and organizations that are in the business of acquiring machine learning datasets, models, and services will be able to consult the quote-unquote nutritional facts on the labels of these technical objects, and because this will enable them to be more discriminating consumers, the market will reward producers whose products are documentedly more ethical. And third, if an individual does end up getting harmed by a machine learning system, the metadata maximalist documentation will provide them with the evidence they need to have their harms redressed by the justice system. In order for these theories of change to be effective in securing FACT outcomes, there are a number of things that would have to be true about the world. The researchers and developers of machine learning datasets, models, and services would have to be empowered to design and develop digital objects in such ways that profit and corporate power were subordinate considerations relative to FACT norms. The data supply chain would have to be structured so as to preserve and contribute to metadata at all points along a digital object's lifecycle, so that metadata was intact and comprehensive by the time that object reaches a prospective user or consumer. Subjects affected by digital systems would know exactly which specific systems were affecting them at particular times and in particular ways. They would have access to metadata-based documentation of these digital objects and systems, and they would be able to leverage that documentation in an adjudication process should their rights be violated by those objects or systems. These conditions do not accurately describe the world in which we live. But even if these conditions were ground truth, the metadata maximalist approach to facilitating social goals would still be problematic. The metadata maximalist strategies and FACT approaches broadly invest their attention and efforts within the lab of machine learning, that is, in the contexts and among the people involved in researching and developing datasets, models, and services. The mainstream of FACT research proposes to accomplish social goals by making processes in the lab more just. This focus carries several implications. First, lab centricity narrows attention to certain stages of production. Metadata maximalism in particular focuses on the stages of development that occur prior to meaningful contact with or deployment into real-world contexts of use at scale. As a result, metadata maximalism forces itself into a position in which it produces documentation of how various social interests are implicated in the production of ML datasets, models, and services, without ever directly involving the participation of the stakeholders who actually hold these interests. Second, lab centricity also restricts where these conversations are held and who is involved. Construing discussion of machine learning systems as technical and proprietary, lab centricity conditions and contains socially consequential deliberations, and in doing so, it reinforces the political agency of the companies at the centers of machine learning research and production. In other words, FACT's lab centricity empowers the powerful at the cost of the participation of affected data subjects and the institutions historically responsible for the realization of their rights. One of the costs of focusing on the lab is a corresponding investment in error prevention rather than detection and remediation. This further aligns FACT with the commercial and policy interests of tech corporations. In a world where the social harms of ML errors or misuse are resolved before they occur, why would we need regulation? Imaginary technical systems that do not produce errors support and legitimize the maximization of dataset, model, and service reusability and expansion. Remember the set of capabilities we listed earlier as necessary for the governance of systems with social goals? Metadata maximalism represents an overinvestment in enabling due diligence at the cost of undermining impact assessment, adaptation, and stakeholder participation capabilities. And the way in which metadata maximalism purports to support the capability of due diligence ignores the fact that due diligence requirements are always contextual and can't be one-size-fits-all designed for upstream. Furthermore, metadata maximalism, like we argue many FACT projects, fails to grapple with the structural incentives and institutional landscapes that actually shape how ML systems reach their eventual subjects. First, the supply chain by which datasets, models, and services actually reach recipients behaves like a shredder for maximalist metadata. Intermediaries like data brokers need their recipes to stay secret in order to retain competitive advantage. The creation of synthetic data and the reduction of multivariate data to one-dimensional scores, for instance, also occurs within the context of this nearly unregulated marketplace. These practices are important to the profit margins of information intermediaries. These intermediaries then are bound by their fiduciary duty to their shareholders to protect and sustain these practices of opacity and obfuscation. The chances of maximalist metadata actually making it all the way to the operators, much less the subjects of machine learning systems, diminishes accordingly. Second, even if that information made its way to subjects harmed by machine learning systems, what would they do with it? Every justice system in the world right now has issues with access to justice, predictably burdening historically marginalized peoples most. In many cases, subjects of machine learning systems are not even aware of such systems' operation, as in the case of automated fraud detection systems or predictive policing applications. Giving harmed individuals in this context information purportedly to empower them displays at best ignorance and at worst cynicism. The good news is that the problems involved in designing for social outcomes from complex systems over time are not new. Varied cultural and institutional traditions provide concrete models for contextual governance that ML practitioners can emulate. Grounding governance discussions in the existing landscape of contextual governance institutions also points to ways that FACT researchers could be working towards interoperability capabilities based on the practices and requirements of community-based organizations, professional associations, local governments, and human rights bodies. In our paper, we go into more detail about contextual governance design patterns. Here, we'll focus on two very high-level recommendations. First, we recommend that FACT researchers place their critical attention on phases of digital production beyond the lab. Each stage of development carries with it its own forms of risk to stakeholders and dependencies on other entities. If we look at how forms of production in mature industries have historically navigated risk and responsibility across these phases, we can start to glimpse some other possibilities for FACT. Second, we recommend that FACT research invest in developing models of stakeholder participation that integrate and proactively support the agency of public and justice institutions. Already, some FACT researchers have demonstrated that partnering with community organizers and political activists productively opens up new design spaces for normative intervention. There are not only practical approaches to implementing contextual systems of governance, there are existing models across a range of vital service industries, and almost all of them center in some way structures and rules for devolving authority to local institutions. In order for the FACT community to achieve its goals, it should start by recognizing A, that FACT principles are realized almost entirely outside of the lab, B, that the institutions and processes for safeguarding those principles in practice are contextual, devolved, and adaptive, and C, while harm-based diligence and remediation efforts are valuable, if these capabilities are designed and intended to primarily inform governance within the lab, they still function to centralize agency away from rights holders. If the FACT community is serious about actualizing its organizing principles in the implementation of digital systems, it's better served by designing structures of participatory self-governance for rights holders, in addition to the developers and operators currently targeted by its interventions. The realization of fairness, accountability, and transparency are far more commonly the product of messy, participatory governance than of technocratic experts perfecting digitally abstracted governance processes. Finally, continuing to develop and deploy datasets, models, and services whose inevitable errors, unpredictable proliferation, and unaccountable use will harm subjects without access to rights enforcement is a profoundly cynical form of neglect. At this stage of maturity, neither novelty nor naivete is an excuse. As Deb Chakra puts it, any sufficiently advanced negligence is indistinguishable from malice. Thanks for listening.